Ladies and gentlemen, boys and ghouls, fiends of all ages, welcome back. I'm Anarchy Ass. We are in Forest Park, Illinois today. I hope you can hear me over the wind and traffic noise. We are in a cemetery. This is Woodlawn Cemetery. It looks like a very typical 20th century cemetery to look at it. Very park-like. Nothing too out of the ordinary until you look at these. These stone elephants behind me with their trunks turned downward, indicating sorrow. Approximately 100 yards away, way down that way, are two more. And they mark off this huge section of land behind me, which is known as Showman's Rest. It looks like a typical cemetery plot with seemingly typical graves, but it's not. What this actually is the site of a massive, and I do mean massive, mass grave. We're talking a body pit. It's been kind of disguised. I hate to use that term, but if you look down at these grave markers, you can see that they are positioned to look like typical graves, and they're really not. This was one open pit where coffins, caskets, were just thrown in and buried en masse. They were not set in burial vaults, which is now the law in Illinois. Apparently it wasn't in 1918 when most of these graves were put in. I say most because there were graves added later that don't date from that time period. But what time period is that? What exactly am I talking about? On June 22nd, 1918, at 4 a.m., a train wrecked at Hessville, Indiana. It's called the Hammond train wreck, but it really was not in Hammond, Indiana. It was 5.5 miles east of Hammond, at a place called Hessville, which is, wind is so bad out here that it just took the camera. That was not me moving the lens, that was the wind. So I really hope you can hear me over that. It's been a constant problem on this show. Alonzo Sargent, train conductor, fell asleep and crashed into the Hagenbeck Wallace Circus train. He was running another train at that time, fell asleep in the engine, and his train just plowed full speed into this circus train, erupting it into flames. It killed 56 performers who are buried in this mass grave, and that's an estimate. These bodies were charred beyond recognition, and some of them don't even have names. There are some graves that just have the circus performer's name, their stage name, on the stone because they had recently joined the circus and there was no paperwork for them. Nobody really knew who they were. Other bodies were not even identifiable because this train just, back in those days, trains were largely wood, and the whole thing just went up. These performers were asleep at the time. This train was parked on the rails, and it was just a massive devastation of death. I have a picture. This is from 1918 of the actual wreckage. Sorry, that's upside down. Here we go. It's kind of hard to see, but that's the engine here on the right here. Old school locomotive from 1918, and it just plowed into the rear cars, which caused a kind of accordion effect with the train and just absolutely leveled it. Over here in this section, some of the older graves, there is a marker explaining this. The Showman's League of America had recently purchased cemetery land here for the use of burying its performers over the course of years. And when this happened, they were forced to use a lot of this at once. And they brought in the bodies, ironically, by train. There's a set of tracks out that way. There used to be. They've been uprooted. And the bodies were transported here and just dumped. First, I want to show you this plaque. I've got some photos of the open mass grave pit. There's a plaque here that has since been set up. This is more recent. And you can see the large elephant. There's actually 5 of them if you count this larger elephant over here. That marks the boundary. Behind that is Cermak Road. If you're ever trying to get out here, or as the GPS likes to call it, Chermik Road. It's actually Cermak Road. And there's a very cool statue behind it. But as we walk this way, we get into the older section of Showman's Rest with the actual 1918 bodies. I was going to point out some of the colorful names that were put on these gravestones. There's a clown named Baldy. That was not a reference to me. But now, of course, I'm only finding actual names. But I do want to give you a comparison. This is what Showman's Rest looks like today. If the wind will leave it alone long enough, here's a picture of the open body pit. You can see the coffins are just laid out next to each other. And you can tell by the people standing on the top that these coffins are not even the regulation 6 feet down. They just dug a big square and put coffins in next to each other. They're not even spaced out. There's no way that that would be allowed today. I think I have another photo of it here. This one's a little more grainy, but is a little more up close. You can see the coffins, one right next to the other. They had one funeral for all these people. And here's what it looks like today. Body pit, present day. Body pit, present day. This is the only example of a mass grave in the Chicagoland area. I want to say that it's the only example of a mass grave in Illinois that isn't Native American. This is just unbelievable. I don't really know how to explain it other than they couldn't keep bodies in storage the way they can now, at least not at this facility, and they must have just been rushed to bury them. Also, with that number of people who have no family or friends or contacts, it was probably unlikely that anybody would come to their individual funerals anyway. So there's that explanation, but this is just my conjecture. I really have no idea why this was done. It is bizarre, to say the least. Here, of course, are the other elephant markers. That's the easiest way to find this. If you do visit the cemetery and you want to find this mass grave, one thing I want to say about Showman's Rest is that it was memorialized later for 100 years afterwards, up until coronavirus stopped it from happening. There was a yearly gathering of circus performers at this site to commemorate their dead. And obviously, at that late date, nobody attending even had any memory of the original performers or knew them. So I feel as if they're more well known in death than they were in life. The Hagenbeck Wallace Circus was not a large one. It was a competitor of Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey. It was one of many traveling circuses at that time. They were very common. They were much more common in the First World War than they were in later 20th century or now. So there is that. It is something that's remembered to the point where the mayor of Forest Park came out and spoke at these gatherings of circus performers who would show up in costume, which really, from my perspective as a viewer, made it even more bizarre. I was glad that they were still memorialized and remembered, but it really was a bizarre sight to hold. This was taking place in the cemetery, in front of this mass grave, where these performers were just dumped, really. I'm going to take a walk back now. There is a large, almost naval-style flagpole on this site that I wonder if that came from the train or was some sort of has some sort of connection to the site. Yeah, let's start setting off the sirens. Folks, one reason I don't like filming is because cars like this pull up and stare, and then every siren in Sirenville has to be set off, as if the sound quality on this show isn't bad enough. We're going to walk through this. I'm walking the full length of this now, and I do want to say that it's approximately 100 yards long. It is not as wide as a football field, but definitely as long. And we're now in the older section. Here, I want to show you some of these graves because they have really bizarre. This one just says unknown male. They all have the date of June 26, 1918. These are all unknown graves. And it's just row after row of these. They're not even spaced out correctly in terms of the width apart from head to toe. So I don't think that these stones are even accurately matched up to any real bodies. Here's one where it's just I was mentioning this grave earlier. Here's the grave of a horse driver. People have left coins for them. And there is also another plaque that explains this, not to the detail that I did, but it does sit here on the perimeter. And I do want to clarify that the body toll that I gave earlier was not the death toll. That is an approximation of how many people were buried here, but I see actually from this that it was 86 people that perished total. Obviously, not all of them being buried at this site. That's all I really have to say about Showman's Rest. I will say that this has been the subject of many supposed ghost sightings. People even claim to hear the sounds of perished circus animals, even though there are none buried on this site. And it's also been the subject of numerous films, most notably the ghost hunter Richard Crowe's documentary series, in which he came out here and filmed this, and also the zombie horror film Showman's Unrest, which I reviewed on this show. Really a cult classic. I highly recommend seeing that. It is historically accurate for approximately the first 2 minutes, and then they give you the backstory of the train wreck and the graves, and then it lapses into a zombie film in which the clowns come back to life. I haven't seen any zombie clowns out here today, though. So thank you for joining me on this trip, this train trip back in the history of death. I'm Anarchy Ass. Until next time, don't go playing no T-ball.